Get out of my OR. Dr. Marcus Hale's voice cut through the sterile air like a blade. He didn't look up from the instrument tray. He didn't need to. Every nurse in that operating room froze. I said, get out. You're useless to me. Useless to this patient. Useless, period. He pointed one gloved finger toward the door, and the entire surgical team held their breath, waiting to see if the quiet nurse in the corner would cry, would argue, would break. She did none of those things. Emma Carter simply looked at him. Steady, still, her eyes giving nothing away. And somehow that stillness was the most terrifying thing in the room. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told you don't belong, this story's for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Subscribe to our channel and drop a comment below with the city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Emma Carter arrived at Mercy General on a Tuesday, which was, by all accounts, an unremarkable day to begin an unremarkable chapter. She carried 2 bags into the staff locker room, changed into her scrubs without a word to the 3 nurses, already there chatting about the weekend, clipped her ID badge to her chest, and walked out to meet her assignment. No fanfare, no nerves visible on her face. Just a woman showing up to do a job she had been hired to do. The charge nurse that first morning was a heavy-set woman named Patrice, who had been running the surgical floor at Mercy General for 11 years and had seen every kind of new hire walk through those doors. The wide-eyed ones fresh out of nursing school who nearly fainted the first time a trauma came in. The burned-out ones transferring from other hospitals, dragging their exhaustion behind them like a chain. The overconfident ones who thought experience from another institution made them untouchable. Patrice had seen all of it. She studied Emma for exactly 30 seconds before assigning her to the trauma bay and moving on. You've got trauma rotation today, Patrice said, handing her a tablet. Don't get in the way of the surgeons. They like their space. Understood, Emma said. That was it. That was the full conversation. By the end of her first shift, 3 people asked Patrice who the new nurse was, not because Emma had done anything remarkable, but because she had moved through the chaos of a busy trauma bay with a precision that was almost eerie. When a patient came in with a compound fracture and 2 of the newer nurses stumbled over each other trying to set up the IV line, Emma had already done it. Clean stick first try, no hesitation. When the attending physician called for a specific medication dosage adjustment mid-procedure, Emma had quietly cross-referenced it against the patient's chart before anyone else in the room had even registered the request. She said nothing. She simply handed the physician the corrected dose and stepped back. Who is she? One of the residents asked. Patrice shrugged. New hire, 2nd week. She's fast. She's quiet, Patrice corrected. There's a difference in, but even Patrice wasn't entirely sure that was true. Emma didn't socialize during breaks. She didn't join the small clusters of nurses in the break room who swapped gossip about the attending physicians or complained about the scheduling. She ate alone, read from a worn paperback she kept in her locker, and was always back on the floor 2 minutes before her break ended. She wasn't cold exactly. She answered when spoken to. She smiled when smiling was appropriate. But there was a quality to her stillness that made people hesitate before approaching her, a sense that she existed in a slightly different atmosphere than everyone else, one that operated at a different pressure. Her colleagues decided without much debate that she was simply Shaishim, a quiet woman in a demanding profession. Nothing unusual there. They had no idea. The first time Emma crossed paths with Dr. Marcus Hale, she was prepping a surgical suite for a scheduled procedure. She was checking the instrument counts, making sure everything was in order. Running through the mental checklist she always ran through quietly and systematically, the way she had been trained to do in environments where a missed step could mean the difference between a person living and dying. She heard him before she saw him. His voice preceded him into every room he entered. Where is my anesthesiologist? Why is the room not ready? I said 7:30 prep. It is currently 7:28, and this room looks like it was set up by a first-year medical student. He pushed through the door with his entourage, 2 surgical residents trailing behind him like satellites orbiting a difficult planet. He was tall, with dark hair threaded at the temples with gray, and the kind of jawline that photographed well at hospital fundraisers. He had the walk of a man who had never once in his professional life been told he was wrong about anything. His reputation at Mercy General was ironclad. Best trauma surgeon on staff, possibly the best in the state. His outcomes were exceptional. His bedside manner was another matter entirely. Dr. Marcus Hale looked around the room, cataloged everything in about 4 seconds, and then his eyes landed on Emma. You, he said. What's your name? Emma Carter. I'm the circulating nurse assigned to your... Have you done a surgical count? Yes. Instruments and sponges verified and logged. He walked to the tray and looked at it. He didn't touch anything. He just looked the way a man looks at something when he's searching for a reason to find fault. Emma watched him without changing her expression. The retractors are in the wrong position, he said. They're in the standard position per the protocol for this procedure type, Emma replied. The room went very quiet. One of the residents stared at the ceiling. The other found something fascinating to study on the far wall. Dr. Hale turned to look at her fully for the first time. There was something in his eyes that wasn't quite anger yet. It was more like recalibration. The look a man gives when something hasn't behaved the way he expected it to. I didn't ask for a protocol citation, he said. I asked you to fix the retractors. Emma held his gaze for a moment. Then she moved the retractors exactly 2 inches to the left. Better, she asked. He didn't answer. He turned away, spoke to his residents about the procedure, and for the next 40 minutes he acted as though Emma Carter did not exist. She did her job. She was efficient, anticipatory, silent when silence was called for, and precise when precision was needed. At one point during the procedure, she noticed a small discrepancy in the patient's monitored vitals that suggested early-stage hypovolemic stress, and she alerted the anesthesiologist with a quiet word. The anesthesiologist adjusted. The patient stabilized. Dr. Hale never acknowledged it. When the procedure was over, he stripped off his gloves and said to no one in particular, "Next time, make sure I have an experienced circulator, not a trainee." Emma was 34 years old. She had been a nurse for 7 years. She had performed emergency field surgery in 3 combat zones. She had kept men alive with her hand and nothing else in conditions that would have made every person in that room break down and weep. She said nothing. She finished her counts, logged her documentation, and moved on to the next assignment. That was the thing about Emma Carter. She never spent energy on what didn't serve the patient. Whatever Marcus Hale thought of her was not relevant to keeping patients alive. And keeping patients alive was the only thing that had ever mattered to her. The weeks settled into a pattern. Emma worked her shifts. She was reliable, competent, and invisible in the way that truly competent people often become invisible in institutions that reward loudness. The nurses who got noticed at Mercy General were the ones who talked the most, who laughed loudest at the attendings' jokes, who volunteered for every committee, and showed up at every staff social event with wine and smiles. Emma was not that nurse. Emma was the one who was simply always there, always steady and always right. She saved a man's life on a Wednesday afternoon without anyone realizing it had been close. He was a 47-year-old with a chest laceration brought in from a construction accident, and the resident who assessed him marked his blood pressure as stable and moved him to a lower priority bay. Emma looked at the man. She looked at the color of his skin, the way he was breathing, the subtle tension around his jaw. She had seen that look before. Not in a hospital, in places that looked nothing like this. She went directly to the attending. "He's compensating," she said. "He's going to crash." "His pressure is holding," the resident started, but Emma kept her eyes on the attending. "He's compensating," she repeated. "His skin tone, his respiratory pattern, the rigidity around the diaphragm. He needs imaging now." The attending looked at her, then at the patient. He called for an emergency CT. The imaging showed a slow hemorrhage into the thoracic cavity that the initial assessment had missed entirely. The man was in surgery within 20 minutes. He walked out of Mercy General 6 days later. Nobody sent Emma a thank you note. The attending got a commendation from the department head. The resident learned a lesson he would carry for the rest of his career. Emma moved to her next patient. That was a Tuesday. The following Thursday was when everything changed. It started with a code that came in hot, which was hospital shorthand for a situation already moving too fast for anyone to feel fully in control of it. A 41-year-old woman, a teacher named Patricia Ruiz, had collapsed at home with what her husband described as sudden, severe chest pain radiating into her back and jaw. The paramedics had worked on her in the ambulance. She arrived at Mercy General, pale, diaphoretic, and barely holding on. The trauma team assembled fast. Dr. Hale was on call, and when Marcus Hale was on call, the room arranged itself around him, whether anyone intended that or not. "Get me a full panel. Get me an EK. Get me cardiology on the phone," he said, moving to the patient with a controlled urgency that was the closest he ever got to warmth. Whatever his failings as a human being, the man cared about outcomes. When a patient was in front of him, everything else fell away, and what remained was a surgeon who was genuinely exceptionally good. Emma was his circulating nurse. She had already pulled the crash cart into position before anyone asked for it. She had already noted the patient's abnormal respiratory pattern and the way her blood pressure reading was divergent between arms. She had already begun forming a clinical picture that told a story different from the one the paramedics had transmitted. She waited until there was a pause in the controlled chaos. Then she spoke. "Dr. Hale, the blood pressure differential between her arms is significant. Left arm is reading 18 points lower than right. Combined vital with the back pain and presentation and the diaphoretic onset, I think we should consider aortic dissection before we commit to a cardiac pathway. The room didn't stop, but it slowed just slightly in the way that rooms slow when something lands differently than expected. Doctor, Hale didn't look at her. That's not your call to make, he said. EKG. The EKG is going to show changes consistent with either MI or dissection in the early stage, Emma said. If we treat for cardiac and she's dissecting, the anticoagulants will. I know what anticoagulants do, he said flatly. I went to medical school. Did you? I'm flagging a clinical concern. And I'm telling you to manage your equipment and let me manage my patient. He finally looked at her, and the look on his face was not anger. It was something worse. It was the deliberate, condescending patience of a man who has decided the person speaking to him is not worth serious engagement. Can you do that? Or is that outside your skill set? One of the residents looked at the floor. A tech near the door pressed her lips together. Emma said nothing. She turned back to her station and continued doing her job. But her mind was running. Not with frustration, not with humiliation, with calculation. She had learned long ago that emotion in a crisis was a resource to be managed, not suppressed. You felt what you felt, and then you decided what to do with it. Right now, what she felt was certainty, the kind of bone-deep certainty that came not from ego, but from pattern recognition built over years of operating in conditions where guessing wrong meant watching someone die. She had seen aortic dissection in the field. She knew what it looked like in the first 10 minutes before the classic presentation fully declared itself. She knew it in the color of the patient's face, in the way she was holding her body, and the discrepancy in those blood pressure readings. She was right. She knew she was right. And Dr. Hale was about to treat Patricia Ruiz for a myocardial infarction. The EKG came back. The resident read it and said, ST changes in ferrolateral. There it is, Dr. Hale said. Call cath lab. Wait, Emia said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone felt the ripple. Dr. Hale turned around slowly. It was the slow turn of a man choosing his response. He looked at Emma the way you look at something that has repeatedly surprised you and not in a way you appreciate. Excuse me, he said. The ST changes are also consistent with dissection-related ischemia, Emma said. If you send her to cath and she's dissecting, the contrast load alone could accelerate the tear. I am asking you to order a CT angio of the chest before you proceed. The silence in the room was not comfortable. It was the silence of people witnessing something that could go very wrong very fast in several different directions. Carter, he said, and the way he said her name was careful and deliberate, the way you say a word when you want the weight of it to be felt. You are a nurse. You are here to support the surgical team. You are not here to diagnose my patients. You are not here to second-guess my clinical judgment. And you are not here to interrupt a time-sensitive intervention to lecture me on differential diagnosis. He paused. The pause was worse than the words. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand, Emma said. I'm still asking you to order the CT angio. Someone in the room exhaled very slowly. Dr. Hale pointed at the door. Get out of my OR. Dr. Hale, get out. You're useless to me, useless to this patient, useless, period. He was already turning back to the patient, already moving forward with the cardiac protocol, already done with her. Send in whoever's covering the hall. I need an actual professional in here. And there it was, not the first time she had been dismissed, not the first time she had been talked over, talked around, looked through and spoken to as though her years of experience and her clinical instincts and her read of a human body in distress were nothing more than noise from a background appliance. She had been dismissed by men with more credentials and more arrogance and more certainty than Marcus Hale. She had learned to carry it, file it, and let it be what it was. But Patricia Ruiz was still on that table. Emma walked to the door. She pushed it open. She stepped into the corridor. And she stood there for exactly 3 seconds, running the math in her head, not the emotional math of humiliation and anger, but the clinical math of a woman who had trained in environments where the cost of inaction was always paid by the person in front of you. Then she pulled out her phone and called radiology. This is Emma Carter, Trauma Bay 4. I need a stat CT angiography of the chest ordered. Patient Patricia Ruiz. I'm flagging this as a clinical urgency. I need whoever is on duty to pull this up immediately and be ready for a potential emergency scan. The radiologist on duty was a young woman named Dr. Singh, who had crossed paths with Emma twice before, and both times had found her to be someone whose instincts ran ahead of her words. Who authorized the order? Dr. Singh asked. I'm flagging the clinical concern directly. The ordering physician is Dr. Hale. I need you to be prepared the moment authorization comes through. Carter, I can't run a scan without... I know, Emma said. Be ready. She hung up. She turned and walked back toward the nurse's station. She pulled up Patricia Ruiz's chart on the workstation and began documenting her clinical observations with the quiet, methodical precision of someone who has learned that paper trails matter, that records matter, that the truth, when it needs to be retrieved, needs somewhere to live. Blood pressure differential, left arm reading 18 points lower than right. Presentation consistent with aortic dissection. Concern flagged verbally to primary surgeon at 1342. Recommendation to defer cardiac intervention pending CT, angiography of thoracic aorta. Recommendation declined. She documented everything. The time, the exact words, the response. Then she sat back and looked at the bay where Patricia Ruiz was still fighting to stay alive, surrounded by a team about to take her down a road that Emma was almost certain was the wrong one. The clock on the wall read 13:51. In the bay, she could hear Dr. Hale's voice, low and focused, coordinating the team with the efficient authority that was the best part of who he was professionally. She could hear the rhythmic beep of the monitors. She could hear the sound of a team doing exactly what they had been trained to do. She sat very still. 17 years ago, Emma Carter had sat in a field that looked nothing like a hospital and held a man's aorta together with her hands while she waited for the surgical team to reach her. She had not panicked. She had not prayed. She had simply done what needed to be done and kept doing it until someone else arrived to take over. That man had lived. He was somewhere in Virginia, now she had heard, working at a hardware store and coaching his daughter's softball team. She had never met him again. She had never needed to. Keeping people alive was not about recognition. It was not about being right. It was about the person on the table, and only ever about the person on the table. She stood up. She walked back to the bay. She did not go inside. She stood at the window and she watched. She watched Patricia Ruiz's color, and she watched the monitors, and she watched the readouts with the same cold, patient attention she had once used to watch a ridgeline for movement. 2 minutes later, Patricia Ruiz's blood pressure dropped. Not the expected fluctuation of a cardiac event, a different kind of drop. Sudden, steep, asymmetric. Emma heard the alarm. She heard Dr. Hale's voice change register. She was already moving. She pushed through the door and she said very clearly, very calmly, into the suddenly reconfigured chaos of a room that had just realized it might be dealing with something other than what it thought. CT angio. Now, thoracic aorta. Call Dr. Singh in radiology. She's standing by. Dr. Hale looked at her, and in that look she saw something she had never seen on his face before. Not in the 2 weeks she had worked beside him, not in any of their interactions, not in any moment where he had dismissed her or talked over her or aimed his condescension at her like a precision instrument. She saw doubt. She saw the exact moment when a brilliant, arrogant, genuinely skilled physician looked at the evidence in front of him and began to wonder if he had been wrong. Get me Dr. Singh, he said to the room. Then to Emma, if you're wrong about this. I'm not, she said, and she wasn't. The CT angio confirmed a type A aortic dissection within 4 minutes of the scan beginning. The tear was in the ascending aorta, moving fast. Dr. Singh's voice on the phone was controlled and professional and carried the specific gravity of someone delivering news that changes everything in a room. Dr. Hale absorbed it in silence. His jaw was tight. His hands were still. He was already recalibrating, already shifting into the mode of a surgeon, adapting to a new truth. Because whatever else he was too good at his job to let ego kill a patient. Get me cardiothoracic. Get me a bypass team. Cancel the cath lab. He paused. And get this patient stabilized for transfer to the surgical suite. The team moved. The room moved. The energy shifted from the controlled urgency of a cardiac pathway to the different, denser urgency of vascular emergency surgery. Emma moved with it back into her role, managing her equipment and her position, and the 1,000 small logistical demands of a sudden escalation, doing what she had always done, which was everything necessary and nothing unnecessary. At no point did Dr. Marcus Hale look at her directly again. At no point did he say thank you. At no point did he acknowledge that she had been right, that he had been wrong, that he had dismissed her from his operating room while a woman's aorta was tearing apart inside her chest, that he had called her useless while she was in the process of saving his patient's life. He didn't say any of it, and Emma didn't expect him to. But as she stood at her station, watching the transfer team wheel Patricia Ruiz toward the surgical suite, watching the controlled efficiency of a hospital doing what hospitals do when they are functioning at their best, she felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, not vindication, something quieter than both of those things. The patient was still alive. That was the only math that had ever mattered. The hallway outside the trauma bay was quiet for exactly 4 minutes after the controlled storm moved through it. Nurses moved back to their stations. Residents scattered to their next assignments. The charge nurse, Patrice, appeared at Emma's elbow with the expression of someone who had seen something they were still processing. "You want to tell me what just happened in there?" Patrice asked. "I flagged a clinical concern. It was confirmed. The patient is going to surgery." Patrice looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that contains a question the person asking isn't sure they know how to phrase. "Hale threw you out of the OR," she said. "Yes. And you went to radiology anyway." "I called radiology," Emma corrected. "I didn't have authorization to order a scan. I made sure they were prepared when the order came through." Patrice was quiet. Then she said, "That was a hell of a read." Emma looked at the hallway where Patricia Ruiz had just been wheeled through at the faint mechanical sound of the elevator doors closing at the ordinary hospital corridor that had just been for 23 minutes, a place where someone almost died the wrong way. "She's a 41-year-old teacher," Emma said. "She has to go home." Patrice had no answer for that, neither did anyone else. And in the nurses' lounge 3 hours later, the story was already moving. The way stories move in hospitals from person to person, gaining texture and detail. The nurse who called it, the surgeon who dismissed her, the scan that changed everything. The names were attached. Emma Carter, Marcus Hale. For the first time since Emma Carter had walked through the doors of Mercy General, people were saying her name. She sat in the lounge with her paperback and her coffee, and she read her book, and she thought about nothing in particular. And outside in the corridor, the story kept moving, growing, becoming the thing that stories become when they find the right combination of injustice and redemption and stubborn human competence. In a room on the 4th floor, Patricia Ruiz was in surgery. Emma turned a page. Patricia Ruiz survived the surgery. That fact moved through Mercy General the following morning, the way significant facts always move through hospitals, not announced, not celebrated, but absorbed quietly and collectively by the people who had been in the room when it almost went the other way. The cardiothoracic team had worked for 6 hours. The tear in the ascending aorta had been more extensive than the initial scan suggested, and there had been a moment somewhere around the 3rd hour when the outcome was genuinely uncertain. But Patricia Ruiz was 41 years old, and she was stubborn in the way that people who teach middle school for 15 years tend to be stubborn, and she had held on, and the surgical team had done their and by 6:15 in the morning she was in the ICU with her husband sitting beside her bed, holding her hand and crying in the quiet way that men cry when the worst thing they imagined did not actually happen. Emma heard about it at the start of her shift. She heard it from Patrice, who delivered the information with the same matter-of-fact efficiency. She delivered everything, and Emma said, "Good," and meant it with every part of herself, and then she picked up her tablet and went to check on her first patient of the day. The story, however, had not moved on. The story had spent the night growing. By 7 in the morning, everyone on the surgical floor knew the broad outline. The new nurse had flagged an aortic dissection that the attending had missed. The attending had thrown her out of the OR. She had called radiology anyway. The scan had confirmed her red. The patient had gone to emergency surgery and survived. It was the kind of story that hospitals ran on, the kind that got told and retold and slightly embellished with each telling until it took on the dimensions of legend, and it had been less than 18 hours since it happened, and already 3 different versions were circulating. In one version, Emma had argued loudly with Dr. Hale and refused to leave the OR. In another, she had single-handedly redirected the entire trauma team. In the version that was closest to true, a quiet nurse had said what she knew been dismissed, documented everything, and been proven right before the patient could pay the price for someone else's certainty. Emma was aware of none of this as she made her rounds, because Emma was not in the habit of monitoring what people said about her. She was aware only of the slight shift in how people looked at her when she moved through the corridor. The glances that lasted a half-second longer than usual. The way a group of residents parted slightly to let her pass, a small, unconscious gesture that meant nothing and everything at once. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, precisely without reaction, and filed it away. Dr. Hale was not on the floor that morning. He had a scheduled procedure in OR2 at 8, and before that, the kind of early morning that attending surgeons have when they have spent a night processing something they would prefer not to have to process. So, Emma had no way of knowing what that processing looked like for him. She had a fairly accurate guess. What she did not anticipate was the visit. She was at the nurse's station at 9:47, updating a patient chart, when she became aware of someone standing beside her. She looked up. It was Dr. Raymond Chu, the chief of surgery at Mercy General. He was 61, silver-haired, with a reputation for being fair in the specific way that people in institutional authority are fair consistently, impersonally, and only when fairness served the institution's interests. He had never spoken directly to Emma before. She had seen him at the all-staff meeting her first week and exchanged the standard new employee acknowledgement, which consisted of a nod and a handshake and approximately 0 additional engagement. He was looking at her now with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Carter, he said. Dr. Chu, walk with me. It wasn't a question. Emma saved her chart entry and followed him down the corridor to the small conference room at the end of the surgical floor, the one used for team debriefs and difficult conversations. He closed the door. He gestured to a chair. She sat. He did not. I read your documentation from yesterday, he said. Emma waited. Thorough, he said. Time-stamped, clinically specific. He paused. You've been here 2 weeks. 12 days, Emma said. Where were you before this? Private practice. Before that, federal contractor work. It was the answer she had rehearsed 100 times and delivered with the easy confidence of something that was technically true and strategically incomplete. Dr. Chu looked at her for a moment. Federal contractor work, he repeated in the tone of a man who understands that some answers are designed to close doors rather than open them. Yes, Emma said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Dr. Hale is one of the finest trauma surgeons I have ever seen operate. He is also at times extraordinarily difficult to work with. His outcomes are exceptional. His process is not always conducive to effective team function. He said this in the careful, measured way of someone reading from an internal document they have composed in their own head over many years. What you did yesterday, the documentation, the call to radiology, the clinical flagging that was done correctly, professionally, and it is the reason Patricia Ruiz is in the ICU this morning instead of the morgue. Emma said nothing. I want to be clear that I am not here to reprimand you, Dr. Chu continued. I am here because there will be a debrief. There will be a formal case review. Dr. Hale has been informed, and I need to know before that process begins whether you intend to file a formal complaint regarding his conduct in the OR yesterday. The room was very still. Emma considered the question the way she considered all questions, that carried weight, not quickly, not emotionally, but with a careful, systematic attention of someone who understood that the answer she gave in the next 30 seconds would determine the shape of what came next. No, she said. Dr. Chu's expression shifted barely. No. Filing a complaint won't improve patient outcomes at this hospital. A case review will. Those are two different things. He looked at her for a long moment. Most people in your position would want accountability. The scan was accountability, Emma said. The patient living was accountability. I don't need anything else. He studied her face and she could see him searching it for something performance calculation, hidden agenda, and finding none of those things. Just a woman sitting in a chair who meant exactly what she said and had nothing to prove. All right, he said finally. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Carter, where did you learn to read a presentation like that? The BP differential, the dissection pattern. That's not standard triage nursing. Emma met his eyes. I've worked in some complicated environments, she said. You see a lot. He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He nodded once and left. Emma sat alone in the conference room for 45 seconds. Then she stood up, walked back to the nurse's station and finished her chart entry. The debrief was scheduled for Thursday. It was currently Tuesday. In between, Mercy General continued to function the way hospitals function, relentlessly and without pause, because the bodies that needed care did not pause for internal reviews or difficult conversations, or the slow institutional machinery of accountability. Emma worked her shifts. She was, if anything, quieter than usual. Not because she was rattled, but because she was paying attention in a way that required stillness. She was watching Marcus Hale. She saw him twice on Tuesday. The first time he passed her in the corridor without looking at her, which was not unusual. The second time she was in a supply room when he entered, saw her, and stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air in the room had a specific density to it, the compressed density of an unfinished conversation. Carter, he said. Dr. Hale. He looked like a man who had spent the night working on something and was not yet finished with it. His jaw was set. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind in the way they sometimes were when he was performing his own authority. He looked like Marcus Hale, the surgeon, not Marcus Hale, the institution. The debrief is Thursday, he said. I know. I want to be clear that the case review is standard process. This is not... He stopped, started again. My concern is patient outcomes. What happened yesterday was a near miss. Near misses get reviewed. That's how hospitals improve. Moss looked at him. That's true, she said. He waited for something more. A concession, maybe. An acknowledgement that the situation was complicated, that his read had been reasonable given the initial presentation, that she understood how these things happened. She said none of it, not because she was withholding, but because she was waiting to see what he actually needed to say. You should have gone through proper channels, he said finally. I flagged the concern through every proper channel available to me, Emma said. In the time available, given the patient's trajectory. You went around me. I called radiology and told them to be ready. I didn't order a scan. I couldn't order a scan. When you called for it, they were prepared. That's not going around you. That's anticipating the correct clinical outcome. His jaw tightened. That's one way to frame it. It's the accurate frame, Emma said. Not aggressively, not defensively, just factually in the way that people who have operated in high-stakes environments state facts because in those environments, accuracy is the only thing that keeps anyone safe. He looked at her for a long moment, and again she saw it, that flicker behind his eyes, not quite doubt, not quite respect, but the specific expression of a man being forced to revise a map he thought was already complete. He left without another word. Emma finished collecting the supplies she needed and went back to the floor. Wednesday morning brought a complication she had not anticipated, which was the arrival of Dr. Sylvia Park, head of nursing services, who called Emma into her office at 8:15 and began the conversation with a particular institutional tone that Emma had learned to recognize, the tone that said, "I am on your side, and also I need to manage this situation." "The hospital has received some attention around the Ruiz case," Dr. Park said. She was in her 50s, composed with the specific competence of a woman who had navigated medical institutions for 3 decades and understood exactly where the landmines were. Nothing external, internal, but attention nonetheless. "I understand," Emma said. "I want to make sure you're prepared for Thursday's debrief. HR will be present. Dr. Chu will lead. Dr. Hale will have an opportunity to present his clinical rationale. You'll be asked to walk through your observations and your actions." She paused. "Your documentation was excellent." "Thank you." It was also very precise in a way that suggests Dr. Park chose her words carefully, a level of clinical training that goes beyond standard RN preparation. Emma looked at her without flinching. "I've had additional training, yes. Would you like to tell me about it before Thursday?" "No," Emma said, "not yet." Dr. Park absorbed that. She was too experienced to push. "All right, I want you to know that nursing administration is fully supportive of your position. What you did for that patient was exemplary. Whatever happens Thursday, that doesn't change." Emma thanked her and left. In the corridor, she stopped by the window that looked over the hospital's east courtyard and stood there for a moment, not because she needed the view, because she needed 30 seconds to think without anyone in her peripheral vision. Thursday was coming, and Thursday was going to force a conversation she had been managing the edges of since she walked into Mercy General 12 days ago. The question of who she was, where she had come from, what that training represented. She had answered those questions with careful vagueness for 2 weeks, and she had managed it because she was very good at managing it. But good clinical instincts were hard to hide indefinitely. The Ruiz case had made that clear. She thought about the reason she had come to Mercy General in the first place. Not running from something exactly. Moving towards something. The decision had taken 8 months to make, and she had made it with the same methodical care she brought to everything because it was the right decision, and she had known it was the right decision, and she had also known that it would come with friction. She had not anticipated Marcus Hale specifically. She had anticipated someone like him in the abstract, because institutions always produce someone like him, a person of genuine talent, whose authority had been too rarely challenged, whose confidence had curdled at the edges into something more corrosive. She had worked beside those men in environments far less forgiving than this one. She had learned how to exist in their orbit without becoming what they needed her to be, which was smaller. She was not going to become smaller. She had not been built for that. She pushed off from the window and went back to work. The ICU was on the 4th floor, and Emma had no patients there currently, but at 11:20 on Wednesday morning, she found herself riding the elevator up anyway. She told herself she was checking on a referral. She was not entirely checking on a referral. She walked to the room where Patricia Ruiz was recovering. The door was open. The husband was there again, a stocky man in his 40s with the particular exhaustion of someone who had slept in a hospital chair for 2 nights and intended to keep doing so indefinitely. Patricia herself was awake, which Emma had not expected. She was pale and diminished in the way of someone who has been through something massive and is still making sense of the outer edges of it, but her eyes were open and tracking and alert. Emma started to back away from the doorway. "Hey!" Patricia's voice was hoarse, but it was there. "Are you the one?" Emma stopped. "The one?" "The nurse from the ER. My husband talked to people." Patricia's voice was careful around the effort of speaking. "He said a nurse called it what it actually was." Emma came a step into the room. "I flagged a clinical concern. The surgical team took care of you." Patricia looked at her, the look of a woman who had come very close to not looking at anything anymore and knew it. "My daughter is 7, she said. Emma said nothing. "She starts 2nd grade in September." Patricia's eyes were steady. I needed to tell you that because I don't know your name and apparently you're very hard to find out about, and I wanted to tell someone who would understand why that matters." Emma stood very still. "In 12 days at Mercy General, In 7 years of nursing. In all the years before that, in all the environments where the work had been harder, and the stakes had been clearer, and the cost of failure had been written on the ground in front of her, in all of that, she had not let herself be moved by gratitude. She had been taught not to. Gratitude was for after. Gratitude was what you processed when everyone was safe and the threat had passed and you had the luxury of feeling things again. She was feeling things now. Emma Carter, she said. That's my name. Patricia Ruiz nodded slowly. Thank you, Emma Carter. Emma left before anything on her face could become something she couldn't manage. She took the stairs back down instead of the elevator. 4 flights. She walked them at a steady pace, and by the time she pushed through the door onto the surgical floor, her expression was settled, and her breathing was even, and she was to all outward appearances exactly what she always appeared to be, a quiet, efficient, unremarkable nurse doing her job. She had been at her station for less than 10 minutes when the message came through on her phone. It was from a number she recognized immediately, not from a contact in her phone, because it was not saved there, but from a specific combination of digits that she had memorized years ago and never deleted from her memory because certain numbers once learned stayed with you. She read the message once. Then she turned her phone face down on the desk and stared at the wall for a moment. The message was 4 words. It said, "We know you're there." She knew exactly who had sent it, and she knew exactly what it meant. And she understood with the cold, precise clarity of someone who had spent years operating in systems built on information and access, and that the 12 days of quiet she had purchased at Mercy General were ending. She picked the phone back up. She typed back 2 words. Not yet. Then she put it in her pocket and went back to updating her charts. At 4:15, Dr. Hale came back onto the floor. Emma was aware of him the way she was always aware of the room around her, not watching exactly, but calibrated to any shift in it. She saw him stop at the nurse's station and speak briefly to Patrice. She saw Patrice glance in her direction. She saw Dr. Hale not look in her direction, which was its own kind of deliberate. She kept her eyes on her chart. 5 minutes later, Patrice appeared beside her. "Hale wants you on a consult," Patrice said. Her voice was carefully neutral. Emma looked up. "What case?" "New admit, 48-year-old male multi-system trauma, MVA. They're still assessing. He wants a full team in the Bay." Patrice paused. "He specifically asked for you." The "specifically asked for you" hung in the air between them. Emma set down her tablet. "Okay," she said, and she walked toward the trauma bay where Marcus Hale was waiting, where a new patient was fighting for stability, where the work was what it always was, relentless and necessary, and the only thing that had ever made complete sense to her. She pushed through the door. The room was controlled chaos. 2 residents working, a tech managing monitors, and Marcus Hale at the center of it already, in the rhythm of assessment, his hands moving with the precision that was the best of him. The part she could not fault, the part that had made her flag her concern that first day, rather than simply walk away. He looked up when she entered. "Carter," he said. "Dr. Hale. Patients presenting with internal hemorrhage, abdomen and chest beep dropping. I need another set of eyes." It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement. It was the closest Marcus Hale was capable of coming in this moment to asking for her help. Emma snapped on her gloves and moved to the patient. "Tell me what you have," she said, and they worked. The patient's name was Daniel Forsyth, 48 years old, former high school football coach, hit by a pickup truck that ran a red light at 60 miles an hour. His wife had been in the passenger seat. She had not survived the impact. He did not know this yet. He was too busy surviving. Emma moved to his left side and her hands found the rhythm of the work before her mind fully articulated what her hands were doing, which was exactly how it was supposed to go. Assessment, pressure, priority. The 3 governing principles of anybody in crisis, and they applied whether you were in a trauma bay, at a fully equipped metropolitan hospital, or crouched in a field with nothing but your own 2 hands and whatever was in your kit. "Abdomen is rigid," she said, guarding his maximal left quadrant. He's protecting the spleen. "I see it," Hale said. "Respiratory pattern is compromised on the left. Could be a hemothorax developing concurrent with the abdominal bleed." One of the residents looked up from the IV line he was managing. He was a second year named Torres, who had enough experience to know when someone in the room was operating at a different level and enough intelligence to stop talking and listen. Hale was already calling for imaging. "Chest and abdominal CT stat. Get me type and cross. Get me 2 large bore IVs if Torres doesn't have them both already." "I have one," Torres said. "Carter," Hale said. Emma was already setting up the second line. "Clean stick, first try the same efficiency she had always carried, the same economy of motion that people who had trained in environments where wasted movement cost lives tended to develop as a kind of permanent neurological habit." "Line is in," she said. Daniel Forsyth groaned. His eyes opened briefly, unfocused, and then closed again. His blood pressure on the monitor was low and dropping in the specific pattern of a man whose body was redistributing everything it had left toward the organs that mattered most. He's shunting, Emma said. I know. Hale's voice had no edge in it right now. This was the version of him that existed only when there was a patient in front of him, focused, stripped of the performance of authority, just a surgeon doing the thing he had trained his entire life to do. We're not going to have a long window. No, Emma agreed. They worked in a rhythm that neither of them had established deliberately and that had no business existing given the history of the past 48 hours, but the work made its own rules. Bodies in crisis did not care about professional grievances. They demanded response, and the people in the room either responded or they didn't. The CT results came back in 11 minutes. Hale read them standing, his eyes moving fast over the images, with the practiced speed of a man who had looked at thousands of these. Splenic laceration grade 3. Hemothorax left side significant volume. No spinal injury. He turned. We need to go now. I want OR3. Get me a thoracic and a general surgery team simultaneously. I'll call it in, Emma said. Do that. She was already on the phone. She coordinated the OR prep, the team notifications, the blood product orders, the anesthesia call, all of it moving simultaneously through the efficient routing system she carried in her head, the system that had been built not in nursing school, but in places where the routing had to happen in her head, because there was no phone to call and no OR to prep, and the surgery happened right there on the ground with what you had. 23 minutes later, Daniel Forsythe was in the operating room. Emma was not assigned to scrub in. She handed off to the OR team, logged her pre-surgical documentation, and stepped back. Standard process. She had done her part. The patient was where he needed to be, more stable than he had any right to be given the mechanism of his injury, and the surgical team who was taking him from here was capable. She pulled off her gloves at the scrub sink and stood there for a moment, hands under the water. Behind her, she heard the door to the scrub area open. She knew it was Hale before he spoke the same way she had always known things before they fully declared themselves through the accumulation of small data points her brain processed before her consciousness caught up. You've done field triage, he said. It wasn't a question. Emma turned off the water. I've worked in complicated environments. She said the same answer she had given Dr. Chu, the same door she had constructed for every version of this conversation. That's not an answer, he said. It's the answer I have right now. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and he had the expression of a man who was assembling a puzzle that was beginning to show him a picture he had not expected. I've worked with a lot of nurses, he said. A lot of very good nurses. The BP differential read yesterday, most attendings wouldn't have caught that on initial presentation. The way you placed that second IV just now, the angle, the speed, the way you prioritized. He stopped. Where did you train Johns Hopkins for my RNM? Emma said. Additional training in a variety of settings. Variety of settings, he repeated. Yes. Does Dr. Chu know what those settings are? Dr. Chu knows what I've chosen to tell him. Something shifted in his expression. Not frustration exactly, more like the recalibration she had seen before, the specific look of a brilliant man encountering a set of facts that do not fit the framework he has been operating with. Why are you here? He asked. At Mercy General, specifically. Emma looked at him. She thought about the 8 months of decision-making that had preceded her first shift at this hospital. She thought about the phone number she had not saved in her contacts and the 4-word message and the 2-word reply. She thought about Patricia Ruiz's daughter, who was starting 2nd grade in September. Because this is where I decided to be, she said. He held her gaze. For a moment, the scrub room was very quiet. Then he said something she had not expected from Marcus Hale, which was, I'm sorry about yesterday, the OR. What I said. The words landed differently than she had imagined they would, and she hadn't imagined them at all, which was perhaps the point. Okay, she said, that's all you've got, okay. What would you like me to say? He almost laughed. It was a short, involuntary sound that surprised both of them. I don't know, he admitted. I expected more from him. I don't do more when less is accurate, Emma said. You apologized. I heard it. The patient is in surgery. That's what matters. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something closer to disbelief, the specific disbelief of someone being shown a way of operating in the world that is genuinely foreign to them. He pushed off the counter and moved toward the door. Then he stopped. The debrief is tomorrow morning, he said. I'm going to present the case accurately, including my initial misread in the clinical flag you raised. Emma said nothing. I wanted you to know that, he said, before tomorrow. She nodded once. He left. She stood at the scrub sink for another moment. She was aware of something shifting in the structure of what was happening at this hospital, a slow tectonic movement beneath the surface that she had felt building since the Ruiz case, and that was accelerating now. She had been in enough institutions to recognize it. The moment when the invisible person begins to become visible, and visibility, once it starts, does not easily reverse itself. She thought again about the message on her phone. We know you're there. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the day she accepted the position. The only question had ever been timing, and timing in her experience was rarely something you controlled. You managed it, you shaped it at the edges, and then you responded to it when it arrived. She went back to the floor. She had 4 patients to check on and 3 charts to update, and the ordinary, relentless machinery of hospital nursing to attend to, and she attended to it with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to every shift for the past 2 weeks. Thursday morning, the debrief room was on the administrative floor, one level above the surgical suites, a room designed for exactly this kind of meeting, formal enough to signal seriousness, neutral enough to allow all parties the fiction of objectivity. Dr. Chu sat at the head of the table. To his left, the HR director, a woman named Carol Simmons, who had attended approximately 1,000 of these meetings and had the composed, attentive expression of someone who processed institutional conflict the way others processed weather as a natural phenomenon to be navigated rather than prevented. To Dr. Chu's right, Dr. Park from Nursing Administration, then Marcus Hale, then Emma, then an empty chair, and then Torres, the second-year resident who had been in the room for the Ruiz case and was present as a factual witness. Dr. Chu opened with the procedural language that these meetings required, establishing the purpose, the process, the expected outcomes. Emma listened. Hale looked at the table. Torres looked at his hands. Then Dr. Chu said, Dr. Hale, would you walk us through your clinical rationale for the initial cardiac pathway? And Marcus Hale did something that Emma suspected did not come naturally to him. He told the truth, the full truth, without hedging, without reframing, without the subtle linguistic maneuvering that people who are accustomed to authority often use when they are forced to account for their errors. He described the presenting symptoms, the initial EKG, read the clinical reasoning that had led him toward a cardiac pathway, and then he described the blood pressure differential that Emma had flagged, and he said clearly, and for the record, that he had dismissed the concern, and that the concern had been correct, and that the patient had nearly died as a result. The room was quiet for a moment when he finished. Carol Simmons made a note. Dr. Chu turned to Emma. Carter, can you walk us through your observations and your subsequent actions? Emma walked them through it, concisely, without embellishment and without false modesty. She described what she had seen in the patient's presentation, the specific data points that had formed her clinical picture, the flag she had raised, the dismissal, the documentation, the call to radiology, the steps she had taken within the boundaries of her authority. She was precise about those boundaries. She had not overstepped them. She had worked to the edges of what she was permitted to do and no further. When she finished, Carol Simmons looked up from her notes. Carter, I have to ask, and please understand, this is a standard inquiry for case review. Your clinical assessment in this case demonstrated a level of diagnostic pattern recognition that is, well, it's notable. Can you speak to your training background? Emma had known this question was coming. She had prepared an answer that was true without being complete, and she was ready to deliver it. She did not get the chance, because at that precise moment, the door to the debrief room opened. Not knocked. Opened. The person who entered first was a woman in her early 60s in civilian clothes, but carrying herself with the specific bearing of someone who had spent decades moving through the world in uniform. Her posture was not a choice. It was a condition. Behind her came 2 men, both in their late 50s, both with the same bearing, the same quality of presence that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with the particular density of people who have commanded others in situations where the cost of failure was measured in human lives. Dr. Chu stood up, not because protocol required it, because the room required it. I'm sorry, he said. This room is occupied. There's a formal debrief in... I know, the woman said. Her voice was calm and direct and entirely uninterested in institutional inconvenience. I'm General Margaret Okafor, United States Marine Corps. These are Generals Patterson and Reyes. We're here because we heard there was a situation developing involving one of our people, and we wanted to make sure the record was complete. The silence that followed was not like the other silences in the room that morning. This silence had texture. Every head in the room turned toward Emma. Emma sat very still. General Okafor looked at her, and there was something in that look, recognition, respect, and the particular warmth of a commanding officer who has not seen someone under her command in too long. Staff Sergeant Carter, she said. Torres made a sound that was not quite a word. Carol Simmons set down her pen. Dr. Hale, seated 2 chairs from Emma, turned to look at her with an expression that was moving through several stages simultaneously and hadn't settled on any of them. General, Emma said. Her voice was steady. It was always steady. I apologize for the interruption, Okafor said to Dr. Chu in the tone of someone who is not particularly apologetic but understands the value of social convention. We'll be brief. We simply want to ensure that whatever review is underway has complete information about the individual at the center of it. Dr. Chu had recovered enough to speak. Please, he said, gesturing to the empty seats at the end of the table. Sit down. The 3 generals sat. The room rearranged itself around them, the way rooms always rearrange themselves around people who occupied a certain kind of authority, not institutional authority exactly, but the authority that comes from having operated in situations where everything was on the line and having come out the other side still intact. General Reyes placed a folder on the table. He didn't open it. Emma Carter served with distinction in the United States Navy for 9 years, General Okafor said. Her final role was as a special operations combat medic, attached to a joint task force operating in environments I am not at liberty to describe in detail. She completed advanced trauma surgery training under field conditions. She has performed emergency surgical interventions in situations where the resources available were limited to what she could carry and what she could fabricate on the ground. Dr. Hale had gone very still. She holds qualifications in emergency medicine, vascular trauma, and tactical combat casualty care that exceed the training of most emergency medicine physicians. Okafor continued. She was selected for her final assignment specifically because of her ability to make accurate, high-speed clinical assessments under conditions of extreme stress and limited information. She was right more often than any system or protocol we fielded could have been. The room did not breathe. The concern she raised about your patient on Tuesday, Okafor said, shifting her gaze briefly toward Dr. Hale, was not a nurse exceeding her scope. It was one of the most experienced trauma specialists we have ever trained doing exactly what she was trained to do. In the field that read would have saved the patient in the first 60 seconds. In your hospital, the delay nearly cost your patient's life. Hale's jaw was tight. He said nothing. Torres was staring at Emma with the expression of a man watching someone he thought he knew reveal an entirely different architecture. Emma looked at the table. She had known this moment was coming since the message on her phone. She had not known it would come here, in this room, in this way. She had imagined she would have more control over the timing. She had imagined she would be the one to choose when and how her background entered the room. She had underestimated Margaret Okafor, which in retrospect, she should have known better than to do. Emma, General Okafor said, and the shift from rank to name was deliberate and carried its own weight. You don't have to keep carrying this alone. Emma looked up. We know why you left, Okafor said. We know what the last 18 months before you separated cost you. And we are not here to pull you back into something you've chosen to step away from. We are here because someone in this room questioned your competence, and we wanted the record to reflect the truth, Dr. Chu said very carefully. What is the truth, General? Okafor looked at him. The truth is that the nurse you have working your trauma floor has saved more lives in more difficult circumstances than most of the people in this building will encounter in their entire careers. And the truth is that whatever she told you about her background when she applied here, she undersold it, significantly. Carol Simmons had stopped writing. She was simply looking. Dr. Hale said quietly, she never told any of us. No, Okafor agreed. She wouldn't. That's consistent with her character. She looked at Emma again. You want to tell them, or should I? Emma held her gaze for a long moment. In that moment, the entire carefully constructed architecture of her quiet, invisible life at Mercy General stood at its inflection point. The 2 weeks of deliberate anonymity, the careful answers, the closed doors, all of it balanced on this breath. She thought about Patricia Ruiz saying, my daughter is 7. She thought about Daniel Forsyth on that table with 2 bleeds and a widow's life waiting for him on the other side of it. She thought about every patient she had not yet met at this hospital, every person who would come through those trauma bay doors in the months ahead, every body in crisis that would require someone in the room who could see what others missed. She looked at Dr. Chu, then at Dr. Hale, then at Torres, whose expression had settled finally into something that looked like awe. My name is Emma Carter, she said. I served 9 years in the United States Navy. My final 4 years were as a Special Operations Combat Medic with SEAL Team 8. I have performed emergency surgical interventions in active combat zones. I have a clinical record and a training qualification file that I am prepared to share with this hospital's credentialing committee at whatever point that becomes appropriate. She paused. I came to Mercy General because I wanted to do this work in a different way. Not in a war, in a place where the outcomes could be different. She paused again. I did not disclose my full background because I wanted to be evaluated on what I did here, not on what I had done somewhere else. I still believe that was the right choice. The room was very quiet. Then Marcus Hale said something that nobody in that room expected, least of all Emma. He said she was right to make it. Every head turned toward him. His jaw was still tight. His eyes were on Emma, and whatever was happening behind them was complex enough that he was visibly working through it in real time, which was for a man who rarely showed any cognitive process he hadn't already resolved a remarkable thing to witness. She came into my OR with no institutional backing, no title, no rank that meant anything in that room, and she stood in front of a surgeon who was being an arrogant son of a... He stopped, glanced at Carol Simmons, who was being difficult, and she held her position. Twice. Because she was right, and because the patient mattered more to her than anything else in that room, including her own comfort. He looked at Dr. Chu. That is not someone who needs their record reviewed. That is someone we should be building a department around. General Okafor looked at Hale with the measured expression of someone revising their assessment of a person in real time. It was a look Emma knew well because she had seen Okafor give it to people in the field when they did something that elevated them from one category to another. Dr. Chu folded his hands on the table. I think he said that this debrief has taken a somewhat different shape than I anticipated. Nobody laughed, but the tension in the room shifted just slightly towards something that wasn't entirely made of weight. Carter, Dr. Chu said, I'm going to ask you to meet with our credentialing committee at your earliest availability. Not as a disciplinary matter, as a matter of ensuring that this hospital properly understands who is working in its trauma bays and what that person is capable of. He looked at her steadily. And I want to say on behalf of this institution that the actions you took on Tuesday in the Ruiz case were not just clinically correct, they were courageous. In the specific, unglamorous way that courage usually is, quiet without applause, and entirely focused on the right outcome. Emma said the patient needed to go home to her daughter. Yes, Dr. Chu said, she did. General Okafor was watching Emma with an expression that contained many things: pride and something that might have been relief in the particular look of someone who has spent time worrying about a person they respect and is now seeing that person, perhaps for the first time in a while, exactly where they belong. She reached across and placed her hand briefly on the folder that General Reyes had set on the table. She did not open it. She left it there like a statement that did not require elaboration. We'll leave you to your process, she said to Dr. Chu, rising. Patterson and Reyes rose with her. She looked at Emma one last time. Staff Sergeant. General, Emma said. The three of them filed out. The door closed. For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. Then Torres, who was 27 years old and had been a physician for approximately 14 months and had witnessed something this morning that he would be telling people about for the rest of his career, exhaled very slowly and said to no one in particular, okay. It was under the circumstances the most accurate thing anyone had said in the room all morning. The debrief officially concluded 11 minutes after the generals left, which was enough time for Dr. Chu to close the procedural record for Carol Simmons to gather her notes with the careful efficiency of someone processing far more than she was showing, and for Torres to excuse himself with the slightly dazed expression of a man who needed air and possibly a very strong cup of coffee. Hale left without a word, but at the door he paused for exactly 1 second and looked back at Emma. And whatever was in that look was not something either of them was ready to name, so neither of them did. Dr. Park walked out beside Emma into the corridor and said nothing for the first 20 steps, which Emma appreciated because those 20 steps were the ones where she was reorienting herself to the fact that the architecture of her life at this hospital had just fundamentally changed, and she needed a moment to take the new shape of it in. You should have told me, Dr. Park said finally. I know, Emma said. I could have protected you better. I didn't need protection, Emma said. I needed to do the job. Dr. Park stopped walking. She turned to look at Emma with the expression of a woman who had navigated the particular intersection of institutional medicine and female professional survival for 3 decades and understood both landscapes with the precise clarity of someone who had paid for that understanding repeatedly. You always need protection, she said, even when you don't think you do, especially then. Emma looked at her, and she heard what was underneath the words, not criticism, not frustration, but something that felt closer to the specific concern of a person who has watched competent women disappear into institutions without a trace and has learned to be alarmed on their behalf even when they are not alarmed on their own. Okay, Emma said, noted. Dr. Park studied her for a moment. Then with the small, controlled smile of someone choosing to accept the terrain as it is rather than as they would prefer it to be, she said, Credentialing committee meets next Tuesday. I'll make sure you're on the agenda. She started walking again. And Carter, next time you have a concern about a patient's care, and a physician dismisses you, come to me first. Before radiology, I'll back you. You didn't know me 2 weeks ago, Emma said. I know you now, Dr. Park said, and she turned and walked toward the elevator. The floor was busy when Emma returned to it, the ordinary, relentless busy of a surgical floor on a Thursday morning, patients and families and staff, and the constant low-level noise of a building full of people in various states of need. Emma moved through it the same way she always moved through it, efficiently and without visible disruption. But the air around her had changed. She could feel it before she could see it, in the way that Patrice looked at her when she came to the station, in the way two nurses who had never initiated conversation with her turned from their workstation, and both started to speak at once, and then both stopped. You don't have to say anything, Emma said. We're not, Patrice said. We're just recalibrating. Takes time, Emma said. I know. She picked up her tablet. She had patients to see. The first was a 63-year-old man named Harold Briggs, who had come in 2 days ago with a hip fracture and was currently driving the day nursing staff to quiet desperation by insisting his pain medication was making him feel strange and repeatedly demanding to speak to whoever was in charge. Emma went into his room and sat down beside his bed, which immediately confused him because nurses at Mercy General did not generally sit down. They spoke and checked and moved on. You're the one in charge, he asked suspiciously. One of them, Emma said. Tell me what strange means. He told her. For 11 minutes. She listened to all of it, the specific quality of the dizziness, the timing relative to the medication doses, the way it was different from the hip pain, and different again from anything he had felt before. She asked 3 questions. She noted 2 things in his chart. She adjusted his medication timing in coordination with the attending physician and flagged a possible drug interaction for pharmacy review. When she stood to leave, Harold Briggs looked at her with the specific expression of a person who has spent 2 days feeling invisible and has just unexpectedly been seen. You actually listen, he said. That's the job, Emma said. She moved to her next patient, and her next. She was on her 4th chart update when Torres appeared beside her, still carrying the slightly altered quality of someone whose worldview has been recently and significantly revised. Can I ask you something, he said. You can try, Emma said, which was not encouragement exactly, but wasn't refusal either. In the field, he said carefully, when you did emergency surgical interventions without an OR, without a full team, how did you manage the decision points? Like the moment when you had to decide to cut and you didn't have imaging, you didn't have labs, you just had what you could see and feel. How did you trust that? Emma looked at him. He was asking the right question, which was not always something you could count on from second-year residents, and he was asking it in the right way, which was genuinely without performance. You don't trust it, she said. You verify it. You use every data point available, and then you use the pattern those data points form, and you act on the pattern, not on a feeling. A feeling can be wrong. A pattern from 5 corroborating observations is almost never wrong. She paused. The thing that breaks people in those situations is waiting for certainty. Certainty doesn't exist in emergency medicine. You act on the best available information before the window closes. Torres nodded slowly. Is that what happened with Ruiz? You had enough corroborating observations to be certain enough. I had the BP differential, the respiratory pattern, the pain radiation, the diaphoretic onset, and the mechanism that made dissection more probable than MON in a patient her age and fitness level. 5 independent indicators pointing the same direction. Yes, I was certain enough. And you knew Hale was going to be wrong. I knew the cardiac pathway was going to be wrong, Emma said. Those are different statements. Torres absorbed that distinction with the expression of someone filing it somewhere important. Okay, he said. Thank you. He started to walk away, then stopped. For what it's worth, he said, the way you handled the debrief this morning, what you said at the end about coming here to do the work in a different way. I thought that was, he searched for the word, real. It was just real. In a room full of people being very careful about everything that was just the actual truth. Emma looked at him for a moment. Go check on your patients, Torres. He went. The morning moved. Hale did not reappear on the surgical floor until just past noon, and when he did, the floor rearranged itself around him in a subtly different way than it had the week before, not because his authority had diminished exactly, but because the information now in the room had changed the geometry of everything. He moved to the nursing station, reviewed 2 charts, and then stood there for a moment with the particular stillness of a man deciding something. He walked to where Emma was standing. I need a word, he said. Okay, she said. He moved to the alcove near the supply corridor, which was as close to private as the surgical floor ever got during working hours. Emma followed. He turned to face her, and she could see that whatever he had been working through since the debrief had reached some kind of resolution, not complete, not uncomplicated, but resolved enough for him to speak. I've been an attending physician at this hospital for 7 years, he said. I have a very specific understanding of how this floor operates and what every person on it is capable of and what my role is relative to all of them. That understanding was wrong in at least one significant way. One significant way, Emma said. I'm not minimizing the rest of it. I know the rest of it is also wrong. I'm working on the rest of it. He stopped, started again. I dismissed you. I called you useless. In front of a full surgical team, I called you useless, and you were in the middle of trying to keep my patient alive. His jaw tightened. I need you to understand that I know the magnitude of that, not just professionally. As a human being talking to another human being, I know what that cost you in that room. Emma held his gaze. She thought about the moment she had walked to that OR door and pushed it open and stepped into the corridor, about the 3 seconds she had stood there, running the math about the weight of that moment, which she had carried without showing it to anyone. It cost me less than you think, she said. I've been in rooms where the cost of being dismissed was a lot higher than professional embarrassment. He was quiet for a moment. I believe that, he said. I'm still sorry. I know, she said. I heard you the first time. Something in his expression shifted, and she saw briefly genuinely what Marcus Hale looked like when he wasn't performing authority. It was a simpler face than the one he usually wore, a little tired, a little more honest about the weight it carried. For what it's worth, he said, the way you worked the Forsyth case yesterday, I've had surgical fellows who couldn't anticipate the way you did. The concurrent bleed identification, the line placement, the team coordination. That wasn't nursing school. No, Emma agreed, it wasn't. I'm going to recommend to Dr. Chu that your credentialing scope be expanded as soon as the committee meets, he said. You should be functioning as an advanced practice provider at minimum, possibly with surgical assist privileges given your field training record. He paused. I want to be the one to make that recommendation. Specifically. Emma looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was doing. He was trying to use his institutional weight to correct for what his institutional weight had initially done to her, and that was not nothing. That required something from a man like Marcus Hale. That's a good use of your authority, she said. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Almost. High praise from you, Carter. It is, she confirmed. He turned and walked back to the floor. Emma stood in the alcove for a moment. Then she followed. The afternoon brought Daniel Forsyth out of surgery, 6 hours and 40 minutes in the ORA splenic repair, and a thoracic drainage procedure and the kind of sustained high-level surgical work that Mercy General's team did when it was functioning at its best. He came out of recovery coherent enough at 4:30 to ask for water and then to ask where his wife was, and the conversation that followed was managed by a hospital social worker and a grief counselor who were trained for exactly this, and Emma was not in the room for it, but she was at the nurse's station when the social worker came out, and she watched the door close and she felt the weight of it, the way she always felt the weight of these moments acutely briefly, and then put somewhere she could carry it without it stopping her from moving forward. You couldn't save everyone. You could save the ones in front of you, and sometimes you couldn't even do that, and you carried both kinds with you always. Emma had learned to carry them efficiently, which was not the same as carrying them lightly. Nothing about this work was light. She had stopped expecting it to be. Patrice found her at 5:45, 45 minutes before the end of Emma's shift, with the expression of someone who has decided to say something and has prepared for the conversation. The floor is talking, Patrice said. You know that. I assumed, Emma said. Not badly, I want to be clear. Nobody's upset. People are just processing. Some of the nurses feel a little strange about not knowing who you were, like they should have. They couldn't have, Emma said. I wasn't telling anyone? Right, I told them that. Patrice crossed her arms, which was her thinking posture. What I want to know is what changes now, for you, here? Emma considered the question. I do the same job I've been doing, better resourced maybe, with a few more people actually listening when I say something clinical. Hale's going to push for expanded credentials. I know. Dr. Chu is going to want you involved in the trauma protocols review he's been putting off for 8 months. I know. Park is already talking about a mentorship structure for the junior nurses. She moves fast, Emma said. She does. Patrice looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated honesty of a woman who had run a surgical floor for 11 years and was not interested in performance of any kind. Are you okay with all of this? The visibility? It's a lot different from what you had 2 weeks ago. Emma thought about that honestly. She thought about the 18 months she had spent after separating from the Navy, moving through the periphery of civilian life, learning how to exist in a world that operated at a different frequency than the one she had lived in for 9 years. She thought about the 8 months of decision-making before Mercy General. She thought about choosing visibility on her own terms, which was different from having it chosen for her. I'll adjust, she said. That's not the same as okay, Patrice observed. Emma looked at her. No, she said, it isn't, but it's honest. Patrice nodded slowly. Fair enough. She started to move away, then stopped. For what it's worth, Carter, the Ruiz call, the way you handled Hale, the Forsyth intake. I've been doing this for 11 years. I know good nursing, and I know when someone in front of me is operating at a level that doesn't have a standard category. She paused. I'm glad you're on my floor. Emma held her gaze for a moment. Thank you, Patrice. It was the most personal exchange they had had in 2 weeks. Patrice accepted it with a brief nod and walked away. At 6:20, 10 minutes before her shift ended, Emma's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. The number again. Not the 4-word message this time, a longer one. Okafor wants to meet in person, not official. Says she owes you a conversation she didn't have when you separated. Her words. Tuesday evening if you're available. Emma stood very still for a moment. She thought about the last time she had seen Margaret Okafor in person, which had been in a debriefing room that looked nothing like the one at Mercy General, in a building that had levels of security clearance on every door, in the specific kind of conversation that people have when one of them is leaving something that cannot easily be left and both of them know it. That conversation had been incomplete. They had both known it was incomplete. There had been too much institutional machinery in the room, too many people whose presence required careful management of what was said and how it was said, and the things that needed to be said between two people who had served together in circumstances that created a specific kind of bond had been left sitting in the space between them like an unfinished equation. She typed back, Tuesday works. She put the phone in her pocket. She finished her last chart entry. She signed out to the evening shift nurse, a capable, methodical woman named Kim, who took the handoff with professional efficiency and no unnecessary conversation, which Emma appreciated. She was pulling on her jacket in the locker room when the door opened and Torres came in, still in his scrubs, the end of a 12-hour shift, written on his face in the specific language of productive exhaustion. Hey, he said, Torres. He sat down on the bench with the heavy gratitude of someone whose legs have been carrying them for a very long time. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, Forsyth is stable. They told him about his wife about an hour ago. He stopped. It was hard. It was really hard to watch. Yes, Emma said. He kept asking if she suffered. The paramedic said it was instant, but he kept asking. He'll keep asking for a while, Emma said. That's normal. Let him ask. Torres looked up. How do you hold all of it? All the ones that go wrong, all the ones that almost go wrong. How do you carry it and still walk in tomorrow and do it again? It was the kind of question that a second-year resident asks at the end of a long day when the professional composure they have been working very hard to maintain has thinned down to something more honest. Emma had been asked versions of it before in different places by different people in languages that were not English, in circumstances that were far more acute than this. She sat down on the bench across from him. You don't hold it away from you, she said. That's the mistake most people make. They think professional distance means not feeling it. It doesn't. It means feeling it and not letting the feeling become the loudest thing in the room. You let it land, you acknowledge it, and then you do your job because the next patient needs you present, not grieving. Torres was quiet for a moment. That sounds really hard. It is, Emma said. It gets easier with practice, but it never gets easy, and it shouldn't. The day it gets easy is the day you need to take a hard look at what you are becoming. He nodded slowly. Then he said, Can I ask you something else? Torres, you have a problem with boundaries. He smiled at that briefly and genuinely. One more thing. The Navy. Do you miss it? Emma considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I miss the clarity, she said finally. In the field, the mission is the mission. The parameters are defined. The cost of failure is obvious. There's a terrible simplicity to it that you can't replicate in civilian life. She paused, but I don't miss what it costs to live inside that clarity for too long. There are things you stop being able to access in yourself, things that take a long time to come back. Torres looked at her. Are they coming back here? Emma stood and picked up her bag. She thought about Harold Briggs and his 11 minutes of feeling finally heard. She thought about Patricia Ruiz and her 7-year-old daughter. She thought about the 4-word text message and the 2-word reply and the Tuesday evening that was waiting at the end of the week. Something is, she said. She pushed through the locker room door and walked down the corridor toward the exit. The hospital around her was doing what hospitals do at shift change, reorganizing itself, handing off, preparing for the night's particular configuration of need and crisis and ordinary human fragility. She moved through it and out the main doors and into the evening air. Her phone buzzed again. Different number this time. Local. She looked at the screen. It was from the ICU. It was a message from a nurse she did not know well, a woman named Dana who worked the night shift on the fourth floor. It said, "Patient in 4C asked us to pass on a message. She says my daughter's name is Sophia. She wanted you to know that." Emma stood on the pavement outside Mercy General and read that message twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and looked up at the sky, which was doing what evening skies do when no one is paying close enough attention to them, turning slowly through colors that don't have exact names, moving from one thing into another without announcing the transition. She had been a shadow in this hospital for 2 weeks. She had understood why she had chosen it, and she had executed it with the precision she brought to everything she chose. But choices like patience evolved in real time, and the best practitioners knew when to revise their protocol. She was not a shadow anymore. She was not entirely sure yet what she was instead, but she had the feeling, steady and specific and sourced from the same place all her best clinical reads came from, that she was about to find out. She started walking toward the parking garage. Behind her, Mercy General continued its permanent, relentless work, and inside it, on the surgical floor, in the ICU and the OR suites, and the trauma bays, the people she had worked beside for 14 days were recalibrating their understanding of who had been standing next to them all along. And at the nurse's station on the third floor, Patrice was briefing the evening charge nurse with the comprehensive, efficient handoff she always gave, moving through patient statuses and pending labs and follow-up flags. And at the end, she said, "Carter's been shifted to a broader trauma consultation role starting next week pending credentialing. For now, she's still on your floor. Give her anything complex that comes in. She'll know what to do with it." The evening charge nurse, a 12-year veteran named Sandra, looked up. "The new hire, the quiet one." Patrice picked up her bag. "She's not particularly new anymore," she said. "And she's not particularly quiet either. She just picks her moments." Sandra considered that. "Who is she?" Patrice smiled, which was an expression Sandra had seen on her face approximately twice in 3 years of working together. "Someone this hospital needed before it knew it needed her," she said, and she walked out. Tuesday came the way significant days often do, quietly, without announcing itself as significant, folded into the ordinary texture of a working morning at a hospital that had not stopped running for a single hour since Emma Carter had first walked through its doors. She was on the floor by 6:50, 20 minutes before her shift technically began, which was a habit so ingrained it had stopped being a choice years ago. The overnight team gave her the handoff with the particular efficiency of people who have been awake for 12 hours and are managing the last stretch on professional discipline alone. 2 post-surgical patients requiring morning assessment. One new admit from overnight, a 68-year-old woman named Ruth Ellison, who had come in at 2 in the morning with a hypertensive crisis and was now stable but fragile, in the specific way of someone whose body has just issued a very serious warning. It intends to be taken seriously. One pending lab flag on Harold Briggs, whose drug interaction review had come back from pharmacy with a recommended adjustment that Emma had already anticipated. She moved through all of it before 7:30. Efficiently, precisely, and with the added quality that the floor had begun to notice over the past several days, which was the quality of someone who was no longer modulating their presence downward. Emma Carter was still quiet. She was still economical with words and movement and the particular energy that some people spent freely, and she had always spent deliberately. But the careful smallness she had inhabited in her first 2 weeks was gone, and in its place was something that filled the space around her differently. Not loudness, nothing like that, but a kind of settled authority that people responded to without always being able to articulate why. Patrice noticed it the morning after the debrief and said nothing, because saying nothing was her highest form of acknowledgement. Torres noticed it and said something because saying something was his, and what he said was, "You seem different," to which Emma had replied, "Same person?" To which he had said, "That's not what I mean." And she had almost smiled and moved on to her next patient. Ruth Ellison was awake when Emma came in, sitting up against her pillows, with the specific alertness of a woman who had been frightened in the night and was not finished processing it. She was 68, retired school teacher, the kind of person who had spent 4 decades managing other people's emergencies and was not accustomed to being the one in the bed. "The doctor said, my pressure spiked to 210/115, Ruth said before Emma had finished reading the overnight chart. "Is that as bad as it sounds?" "It's serious," Emma said. "That's why you're here. The good news is we caught it and you're stable. My daughter wants to fly in from Portland. I told her it was unnecessary." Ruth looked at Emma with the sharp, assessing eyes of a woman who had spent her career reading people. "Was I right?" Emma looked at her chart, then at Ruth. "Call your daughter," she said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. Emma finished the assessment, adjusted the morning medication protocol in coordination with the attending, and flagged 2 items for the cardiology consult that was scheduled for 9. She was thorough in the way she was always thorough, but there was an added layer now. a willingness to write her clinical observations with the full weight of her training behind them, rather than the carefully modulated language she had used in her first 2 weeks when she had been writing for an audience that didn't yet know who she was. That had changed. The credentialing committee met today at 2. Dr. Chu had personally ensured her file was the first item on the agenda. At 8:40, Marcus Hale came onto the floor. He moved to the nursing station, reviewed his surgical schedule, and then walked to where Emma was updating Ruth Ellison's chart. "Ellison," he said, nodding at the chart. "Hypertensive crisis. Cardiology has her. Consult at 9," Emma said. "I've flagged a possible secondary renal component. Her creatinine trend over the last 6 hours suggests the kidneys are under stress. The cardiologist needs to see it before they finalize the management plan." Hale looked at the chart. He looked at the trend she had flagged. He said, "Good catch," in the direct, unadorned way he was apparently learning to deliver acknowledgement. Not effusive, not performed, just accurate. "Thank you," Emma said. He started to turn away, then stopped. "The credentialing committee is this afternoon." "I know. I submitted a formal letter of support this morning, detailing the Ruiz case, the Forsyth intake, and my clinical assessment of your competency level." He paused. "I wanted you to know it was specific, not a general character reference. Specific clinical observations with my professional endorsement of expanded scope." Emma looked at him. In 2.5 weeks, she had watched Marcus Hale move from the version of himself that had pointed at the OR door and called her useless to this version, which was doing the harder, slower work of actually changing. It was not a complete transformation. He was still arrogant in the bone-deep way of someone for whom arrogance had been professionally rewarded for too long. He still walked into rooms as though they had been waiting for him. He still interrupted people and made clinical pronouncements with more certainty than any situation strictly warranted. But there was a new quality to him now, a thin but genuine layer of awareness that had not been there before, and an awareness that the room sometimes knew things he didn't, and that the appropriate response to that awareness was attention rather than dismissal. People change slowly and imperfectly, and usually only when forced to by something that cost them enough. Emma understood this. She did not require completion. She required honesty, and Hale was at least learning to offer that. "That means something," she said. "The letter. Thank you." He nodded once and walked to his next patient. The morning moved through its rhythms. At 10:15, Daniel Forsyth was moved from the ICU to a step-down room on the 3rd floor, which was a clinical milestone that meant his body had decided it intended to continue. Emma was not his floor nurse, but she passed his room, and through the window she could see him sitting up in bed, and she could see that the particular devastation of a man who has just learned the worst possible thing was present in every line of his body, and she could also see that he was upright, that he was eating, that his hands were steady around his water cup, and she thought that the work of surviving grief, like the work of surviving injury, was mostly the work of the body's insistence on continuing. She kept walking. At 11, she got the page she had been expecting for 3 days. Not from the generals. From General Okafor directly, which was different and deliberate. The message said, "Still on for tonight, 6 o'clock. I'll come to you. There's something I should have said 18 months ago, and I am going to say it tonight. Don't cancel on me, Carter." Emma typed back, "I won't cancel." She put the phone away and went to check on Ruth Ellison, whose daughter had booked a flight from Portland 40 minutes after their conversation and was landing at 3. The cardiology consult happened at 9 as scheduled, and the cardiologist, a precise and serious man named Dr. Wei, reviewed the renal component Emma had flagged and ordered 2 additional labs on the spot and revised the initial management plan to account for it. He did not know who had flagged the concern. He found out at 10:30 when Dr. Park mentioned it in passing. At 10:45, he stopped Emma in the corridor. "The Ellison flag," he said. "That was you." "Yes. The creatinine trend interpretation in the context of the hypertensive presentation, that's not standard floor nursing assessment." "No," Emma agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "I heard about the Ruiz case and the debrief." He paused. "I'm going to request that any patient I have on this floor with a complex cardiac renal picture gets your eyes on it, if that's all right with you." "Talk to Dr. Chu about scope," Emma said. "But yes, that's all right with me." He nodded briskly and walked on. Emma turned to find Patrice directly behind her, who had witnessed the exchange and was wearing the expression of someone watching a prediction come true. "Told you," Patrice said. "You didn't tell me anything," Emma said. "I thought it very loudly in your direction." Emma moved to her next patient. By the time 2 o'clock arrived, the surgical floor had found its new equilibrium, which was not dramatically different from the old one. On the surface, patients were still patients. Charts were still charts. The trauma base still received whoever it received without regard for anyone's schedule or preference. But beneath the surface, the floor's understanding of itself had shifted in the specific way that institutions shift when a central piece of information changes gradually at first, and then suddenly, and then as though it had always been that way. The credentialing committee met in the same administrative conference room where the debrief had happened, which Emma noted with the dry internal observation of someone who understands that institutions have limited square footage for significant events. Dr. Chu led it. Present were two senior physicians, Dr. Park Carol Simmons from HR and a physician from the state medical board who had been brought in specifically because Emma's military training record fell outside the standard credentialing pathways and required someone with the authority to create a custom equivalency assessment. Emma sat across from all of them and answered their questions for 45 minutes. She was direct. She was complete. She did not undersell and she did not perform modesty. She described her training, her field experience, her surgical interventions, her qualification record, and the specific competencies she was prepared to demonstrate through whatever assessment process the committee required. She had waited her whole professional life to be in a room where she could say all of it plainly, and she said it plainly. At the end, the physician from the state medical board, a woman named Dr. Arnaud, who had been taking meticulous notes throughout, set down her pen and said, "Ms. Carter, I want to be transparent with you. Your training record as presented by General Okafor's office and supplemented by your military service documentation represents a level of clinical preparation that I have not encountered in a standard credentialing review before. The equivalency pathway I'm going to recommend is going to require some creative institutional thinking, but it is entirely supported by both state regulation and federal statute given your service record." She paused. "In plain language, your qualifications are real. They are extensive, and this hospital would be significantly underutilizing you if it confined your role to standard floor nursing." The room was quiet for a moment. Dr. Chu said, "What are you recommending?" "Immediate advanced practice recognition pending a 30-day supervised clinical assessment, surgical assist privileges in trauma cases, formal trauma consultation role, with a pathway to a hybrid clinical educator position if that's something the institution wants to pursue." Dr. Arnaud looked at Emma. "And if it's something you want to pursue?" Emma thought about Dr. Park talking about mentorship for junior nurses. She thought about Torres asking the right questions at the end of a long shift. She thought about what it meant to carry a level of knowledge through an institution without sharing it, and she thought about what it would mean instead to build something from it that other people could use. "Yes," she said, "that's something I want to pursue." The committee concluded at 3:45. Dr. Chu walked Emma to the elevator himself, which was not a thing he did with people, and in the elevator he said, "I owe you an apology on behalf of this institution." "You hired me," Emma said. "That's not something to apologize for. I hired you and then I watched you nearly lose a patient because my senior surgeon dismissed you, and I did not have the structural safeguards in place to prevent that from happening." He looked at her with the directness of a man in his 60s who has learned that honesty is less expensive than its alternatives. "That's on me and on this hospital's culture, and I intend to address it." "The case review is already doing that," Emma said. "The case review is the beginning," he said, "not the whole of it." The elevator opened. Emma stepped out. She went back to the floor with 45 minutes left in her shift, and she used every one of them. At 5:55, she was in the staff break room, pulling on her jacket, when her phone showed an incoming call from General Okafor. Not a text, a call. She answered. "Change of location," Okafor said without preamble. "I'm already here. I'm in the hospital lobby, the front one with the terrible landscape paintings." Emma stopped moving. "You're here. I told you I'd come to you. I meant literally." A pause. "Also, Patterson and Reyes are with me. I tried to talk them out of it. They were not interested in being talked out of it. Is there somewhere we can sit that isn't a waiting room?" 10 minutes later, Emma was sitting at a corner table in the hospital's ground floor cafeteria across from 3 Marine generals in civilian clothes, which was not a sentence she had expected to be true about her Tuesday evening. The cafeteria was mostly empty. At this hour, the dinner rush, still 40 minutes out, and the handful of people present paid them no particular attention, which was what happened when people who looked like authority decided not to announce themselves. General Patterson, who was the quieter of the two men and had served with Emma's task force for 18 months, set a folder on the table. Emma recognized it as the same folder General Reyes had brought to the debrief, but not opened. This time, Patterson opened it. Inside it was a single document. Emma read the header and went very still. It was a formal commendation. Classified designation, but the summary page was unclassified, and what it described was a specific operational event from Emma's final deployment, an event that had taken place over 11 hours in a location she was not able to name in this cafeteria, in which she had performed emergency surgical interventions on 4 personnel under active fire and had kept all 4 of them alive until extraction. The commendation named her by rank and full name and described her actions with the clinical specificity of a document written by people who understood both medicine and combat and wanted the record to reflect exactly what had happened. This was classified above your access level when you separated, Okafor said. It's been partially declassified, enough to be shared with civilian institutions for professional credentialing purposes. She paused. The full version says more. It uses words like extraordinary and unprecedented, and a few other things that I know you are going to be uncomfortable with. But the summary page is accurate and it belongs in your credentialing file here. Emma looked at the document. She had known in the abstract way that you know things when you are inside them, that what she had done in those 11 hours had been significant. You don't need external validation to understand the weight of your own actions, but there was something about seeing it written down formal and permanent and documented in the official language of institutional record that landed differently than she had expected. You're giving me this, she said. We're giving it to you, Okafor confirmed, and we're giving a copy to Dr. Chu's office, with your permission. Emma looked at her. You already called Dr. Chu? I called him this morning. He was very receptive. Okafor's expression was controlled but not without warmth. He also told me about the credentialing committee meeting, how it went. She paused. I'm glad, Emma. I want you to know that whatever you decide about the offer, about the future, about all of it, I'm glad this is where you landed. What offer? Emma asked. General Reyes spoke for the first time since sitting down. He had a low, deliberate voice in the economy of words of someone who had learned to make each one count. There's a program, he said, Joint Military-Civilian Medical Exchange, developing trauma protocols that can be used in both theater and civilian hospital environments. It's been underfunded and understaffed because we couldn't find the right person to run the clinical component. He looked at her steadily. We found the right person 2 weeks ago when she called an aortic dissection in a trauma bay and then documented it with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. Emma was quiet. It's not a return to active duty, Reyes said. It's a consulting role, structured around a civilian practice base, which could be here. He nodded at the general space around them, meaning the hospital. The two things are not mutually exclusive. We've built it that way deliberately. Because you knew I wouldn't come back otherwise, Emma said. Because we knew you wouldn't come back otherwise, he confirmed without apology. And because you were right that this is where the work needs to happen. Both places, not one or the other. Okafor was watching her with the patient, steady attention of a commanding officer who has made her case and is now willing to wait for the answer to form in its own time. Emma looked at the commendation on the table. She thought about 11 hours in a place she couldn't name and 4 people who were alive somewhere in the world right now because of what she had done in those 11 hours, and she thought about Ruth Ellison calling her daughter, and Patricia Ruiz and her daughter Sophia and Daniel Forsyth sitting upright in a step-down room with his whole broken life ahead of him and his body insisting on continuing anyway. She thought about Torres asking the right questions. She thought about Patrice saying she picks her moments. She thought about what it meant to be useful. Not the word the way Hale had used it as a weapon, the actual meaning of it, the real and unglamorous meaning, which was capable of making a difference to the person in front of you, and the person after that, and the person after that without end, as long as you had the capacity and the will and the knowledge to do it. She had all 3. She had always had all 3. I want to talk to Dr. Chu before I say yes, she said. I want to make sure the hospital role is structured correctly first. The mentorship component, the trauma consultation scope, the protocols review. Those need to be in place before I add anything else. Of course, Okafor said, and I want it in writing. The consulting structure, the civilian base, all of it. Already drafted, Reyes said, waiting for your signature. Emma looked at him. You were very confident I'd say yes. I was confident you'd say the right thing, he said. Those are different. She almost smiled. It was a small thing and brief, but it was real, and Okafor saw it, and her own expression shifted with it, carrying the particular relief of someone who has worried about a person for a long time and is now watching that person be, if not entirely all right, then at least pointed in the right direction. Okay, Emma said. Okay, yes, Okafor asked. Okay, yes, Emma confirmed. Patterson closed the folder and slid it across the table to her. She picked it up. It was lighter than it should have been for something that represented 9 years and 11 hours, and all the distance between who she had been and who she was now. She was still sitting at that table 20 minutes after the generals left the folder in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold beside it, when Torres came into the cafeteria still in his scrubs, heading for the vending machine with the automatic trajectory of someone running on institutional momentum. He saw her. He detoured. You're still here, he said. Apparently, she said. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was a Torres characteristic she had stopped trying to correct. He looked at the folder. Good news or complicated news? Both, she said. Same thing usually. He nodded at that with the wisdom of someone still young enough to find wisdom in simple statements. Then he said, Forsyth ate dinner tonight. Full tray. He asked the night nurse about physical therapy timelines. Emma was quiet for a moment. That's good. Yeah, Torres said. It is. He looked at her. You know what I keep thinking about? What you said in the locker room. About carrying the ones that go wrong. You said the day it gets easy is the day you need to take a hard look at what you're becoming. I remember. I wrote it down, he said, in my notebook. The one I've been keeping since first year of residency, where I write down the things that turn out to actually matter. He paused. I've got about 40 things in there from 3 attendings I've worked with. I've got 3 things from you, and I've known you for 2 weeks. Emma looked at him across the table in the nearly empty cafeteria, this 27-year-old physician who asked the right questions at the end of hard days and wrote down the answers in a notebook and would carry them into every room he worked in for the rest of his career. Keep writing, she said. She stood up. She picked up the folder. She walked out of the cafeteria and through the main corridor and out the front doors of Mercy General into the evening, carrying the documentation of who she had been and walking toward who she was choosing to become. Behind her, the hospital continued its permanent work. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, Ruth Ellison's daughter was landing at the airport and would be there in 40 minutes. Somewhere on the 4th floor, Patricia Ruiz was one day closer to going home to Sofia. Somewhere in a step-down room, Daniel Forsyth was eating a full tray and asking about physical therapy because his body had decided to continue, and continuing was its own kind of answer. Emma Carter had come to Mercy General as a shadow. Quiet, efficient, invisible by deliberate design. She had watched and waited and done the work without announcement the way she had always done the work, because the work had never needed her name on it to be real. But her name was on it now, on the commendation in her hand and in the credentialing file upstairs and in the conversations happening on the surgical floor and in the notebook of a second-year resident who had learned 3 things in 2 weeks that would stay with him for the rest of his life. She had not come to Mercy General to be seen. She had come to do the job. It turned out those 2 things finally were the same.